The moment I walked into that boardroom, I knew I didn't belong there. Not because of how I was dressed, though my blazer was the kind you bought on sale at a Hudson's Bay clearance rack, while every other jacket in that room probably cost more than my monthly rent. No, it was something else. It was the way they all looked past me, through me, like I was part of the furniture they'd forgotten to remove. My name is Patrick Mercer, and at 27, I was the youngest facilities coordinator ever hired by Alderton Capital Group, one of the most established private investment firms in Toronto. I'd gotten the job through a combination of genuine competence and a reference from my uncle, who had done electrical contracting work for the building for 15 years. I wasn't naive about that. I knew which part of that equation carried more weight in a place like Alderton, but I showed up every morning at 7:15, learned every system in that building, and I did the work. That had to count for something. I kept telling myself that. The Alderton Winter Gala was held every December at the Ritz-Carlton on Wellington Street. It was the kind of event where the invitation list read like the financial pages of the Globe and Mail, and where the catering bill alone could have funded a small municipality's parks budget for a year. My job that evening was invisible by design: confirm the AV setup, liaise with hotel staff, troubleshoot anything that went sideways before it had a chance to become a scene. I was background. I understood that. I had made peace with it. What I had not made peace with was what I saw 40 minutes into the evening, when the formal reception gave way to the seated portion and a string quartet from the Royal Conservatory began playing in the corner near the windows overlooking Front Street. I saw her standing alone by one of the tall cocktail tables near the east wall. She was maybe 30, maybe a little younger, in a deep burgundy dress that was elegant without trying too hard. Her dark hair was pulled back simply. One hand held a glass of sparkling water she wasn't drinking, and the other rested on the edge of the table with the particular stillness of someone who has learned, through practice, to take up as little space as possible. Her left hand and forearm were scarred, visibly, unmistakably. The kind of scarring that doesn't fade entirely with time, that changes the texture and tone of skin in ways that catch light differently than the rest of you. She hadn't covered it. She wasn't hiding it under a wrap or a long sleeve. It was just there, part of her, and she was standing alone in a room of 240 people, and not a single one of them had approached her. I recognized her. Not personally, but I had seen her photograph in the framed portraits in the firm's upper lobby. Victoria Alderton, granddaughter of the firm's founder, Gerald Alderton, and daughter of the current managing partner, Robert Alderton, whose name appeared on the building's directory in letters, large enough to read from the elevator without your glasses. She had been living in Vancouver for several years, running some kind of foundation work. From what I'd overheard in the elevator conversations I was never quite part of, she had come back to Toronto recently. No one seemed entirely sure why. I stood near the service corridor entrance for another few minutes. I watched. I counted in my head the number of people who made eye contact with her and then found somewhere else to be. Senior partners who had been loudly debating the merits of Canadian infrastructure investment 30 seconds earlier. Colleagues who were perfectly capable of approaching anyone else in that room with a handshake and a practiced laugh. 14 people. 14. My supervisor that evening was a woman named Karen Pollitt, the firm's head of event logistics, who had made it clear at our briefing that staff were not to interact with guests beyond what was operationally necessary. Facilities people stayed invisible. That was the arrangement. I set my radio down on the linen-covered service table behind me. I straightened my blazer, and I walked across that room. If you believe that the way we treat people at their most vulnerable is the truest measure of who we are, take a second right now to like this video, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Because what happened next changed my life in ways I'm still understanding. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't thinking about what I'd say. I was thinking about the way she was holding that glass of water she wasn't drinking, and the way her shoulders had a tension in them that looked like it had been there for a very long time. When I reached her, I said, "You look like you could use a better view." I nodded toward the windows. The lights on the CN Tower just changed. It does this thing where it goes blue for a few seconds before the sequence resets. Easy to miss if you're standing at the wrong angle. She looked at me. Her eyes were dark and careful, not unfriendly, but assessing the way you look at someone when you've learned not to assume the best too quickly. She said, "You work here?" I said, "I work for the building, technically, Tonight I'm the person who makes sure the microphones don't squeal and the ice sculpture doesn't melt before the photos. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but close to the conditions required for one. She said, "That sounds like the most honest job description in this room." Her name was Victoria Alderton, though she introduced herself simply as Vicky, and she said it with a slight emphasis that told me she used the shorter name deliberately, that it was a choice and not a habit. We stood by the windows, and I pointed out the CN Tower light sequence, which was not something I had ever paid particular attention to before that moment, but which turned out to be real, because Toronto is full of small, beautiful things that people walk past every day without seeing. We talked for 22 minutes. I know because I was acutely aware of my radio on the service table, and the fact that Karen Pollitt had a direct line of sight to where I was standing. But I stayed. Vicky asked me how long I'd been with Alderton. I told her 18 months. She asked if I liked it. I told her the truth, that I liked the problem solving, that I liked knowing a building's systems well enough to diagnose a fault before it became a failure, and that I found the human dynamics of the place genuinely fascinating, though not always in a comfortable way. She laughed at that. Not a polished, social laugh. A real one, slightly surprised, the kind that happens when something lands before your guard has a chance to go up. She asked what I meant. I said, "I mean that the people in this building spend a lot of energy managing how they're perceived by people they're not sure they even like. And tonight, watching this room, I think some of those habits are costing people things they'd care about if they were paying attention." She looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then she looked down at her left arm, resting on the table between us, and she said, "How long have you been standing here not looking at it?" I said, "The whole time," she said. "Most people last about 4 seconds. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence is the right answer. Sometimes it's the only honest one." We stood there for another few minutes watching the city lights. Then Karen Pollitt materialized at my elbow and said, with professional pleasantness, that I was needed at the AV station. I excused myself. Vicky nodded and said, "Thank you," in a way that was quiet but complete, like she meant it without needing to make a production of it. I spent the rest of the evening doing my job, and I did not look back at the east wall, because I had done what I came to do, and looking back felt like it would ruin something. I thought that would be the end of it. The following Thursday, I was called into Robert Alderton's office on the 31st floor. Robert Alderton was 63 years old, with the bearing of a man who had navigated serious rooms for 40 years, and had long since stopped being impressed by anything that didn't warrant it. He had built on his father's foundation and doubled the firm's assets under management in 2 decades. He was not a man who summoned facilities coordinators to his office to discuss AV setups. I rode the elevator to 31 with my stomach doing something unpleasant. I was certain I was being let go. I ran through the possibilities. Had I violated some protocol by speaking with a guest? Had Karen Pollitt filed a formal complaint? Had I, without realizing it, crossed a line so obvious that everyone in the room had seen it except me? Robert was standing at the window when I came in, looking out at the harbor. He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was not what I expected. It wasn't the contained courtesy of someone about to deliver bad news professionally. It was something more complicated than that. Evaluating. Trying to categorize something that didn't fit his existing categories. He said, "My daughter spoke to me about you." I didn't respond because I didn't know yet where this was going. He said, "She told me you spent 20 minutes talking to her about building systems and CN tower lighting patterns in the sociology of corporate parties." I said, "That's an accurate summary." He almost smiled. He said, "She also told me you looked at her like a person." He said it flatly, without dramatizing it, and that made it worse. Somehow it made it the saddest sentence I'd heard in a long time. He asked me to sit down, and then he told me about his daughter. 3.5 years earlier, Vicky had been driving back from a camping weekend in Algonquin Park with 2 friends. It was a Sunday evening in late October. Raining, the highway slick, a transport truck in the northbound lane jackknifed across the median and struck 2 vehicles. One of those vehicles went off the road and caught fire. Vicky had pulled over, gotten out of her car, and gone to the burning vehicle. She had gotten the driver and a 7-year-old child out before the fire spread to the fuel tank. She had not gotten out entirely unscathed. The burns to her left hand and forearm had required multiple surgeries. The recovery had taken the better part of 2 years. The physical part, anyway. The CBC had covered the story initially. There had been a commendation from the OPP, a letter from the provincial government, and then the news cycle moved on, as it does, and what remained was Vicky with her scars and the particular way that certain rooms changed when she entered them. She had moved to Vancouver partly to be somewhere, no one knew the story, partly because the Vancouver Foundation work was real and meaningful and gave her something to move toward rather than away from. She had come back to Toronto for the Christmas season because it was home and because she was trying. Robert Alderton was not a man who found the next part easy to say. I could see that. He stood at his desk and chose his words with care, the way you do when you're talking about something that has cost you more than you know how to quantify. He said, his daughter had not laughed at a social event in longer than he could remember. He said she had told him that for 22 minutes by the east windows, she had forgotten to monitor how she was being perceived, because the person she was talking to was simply talking to her. He said, I don't have a formal rationale for this, but I have an opening on the Foundation's community liaison team, and I'd like you to consider it. The Alderton Family Foundation worked primarily in 3 areas: emergency response training in northern and remote communities across Ontario and Manitoba, bursaries for students entering healthcare and social work, and a network of peer support programs for people recovering from accident-related trauma. It was serious, substantive work, and it operated with a rigor that matched the firm's investment side. I took the job, not because of what it might mean for my career, though I'd be lying if I said that didn't cross my mind. I took it because the work mattered, and because somewhere in that conversation with Robert Alderton, I understood that saying no would be the wrong kind of caution. Vicky was not part of my day-to-day work. Not at first. The foundation team was a small office on King Street West, separate from the main firm. I spent my first 3 months learning the programs, building relationships with the partner organizations in Sudbury and Thunder Bay and Sioux Lookout, understanding the actual texture of what the foundation was trying to do. She came in occasionally, quiet at first the way she'd been by the east windows at the Gala, listening more than speaking in team meetings, offering an observation when she had one, then letting it stand without defending it. She had a clarity of thinking that I came to recognize and genuinely admire. She wasn't performing expertise, she just had it. We didn't become close quickly. That's not how it worked. There were weeks where I saw her twice and weeks where I didn't see her at all. But there were also Tuesday afternoons where she'd end up at the desk next to mine going through foundation reports. And we'd talk. And the conversations had a quality to them that I hadn't found in many places. She asked questions that assumed you had a real answer. She listened like she actually wanted to know what you thought, not just what you were willing to say. She told me, in parts, over months, what the years since the accident had actually been like, not the version that appeared in the Foundation's donor materials, where her story was already being shaped into something useful and digestible. The actual version, the surgeries and the skin graft recovery, and the specific cruelty of burning yourself helping someone else, and then watching how certain people recalibrate their interactions with you afterward. The job interviews where she'd noticed people's attention move to her arm and never fully come back, the first date coffee that ended politely and early, the way her mother, who loved her without condition, had still learned to seat her at tables so that her left side faced the wall. I listened. I didn't try to fix any of it because none of it was mine to fix. I just kept showing up and treating it like the conversation it was. There were hard stretches. The foundation did an event in the fall, a fundraising dinner that Vicky attended and spoke at. She wore a sleeveless dress, not a statement, she told me afterward, not intended to be. She was just warm and she'd wanted to be comfortable. An old family friend, a man who had known her father since law school, came to her afterward and said, with the absolute confidence of someone who believed they were being helpful, that she might want to think about the image the foundation was projecting. She told me about it the next morning, standing in the foundation kitchen making coffee, and her voice was steady but her hands weren't. I was angry. I want to be honest about that. I'm not someone who gets angry easily or performs it well, but I was genuinely angry, the kind that sits quiet in your chest and makes you careful about every word because you know some of them would come out wrong. What I said was, he's wrong, and I think you already know that, which is why you're telling me and not your father. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my father would have said something to Hims. I said, I know. She said, I didn't want that to be the story. I understood that. She wasn't protecting the family friend. She was protecting her own agency in the narrative of her own life. That distinction mattered. She spoke at a session for trauma recovery program participants in Hamilton in the spring. It was a smaller room than the foundation dinner, a community center on the east side of the city, folding chairs and fluorescent lights and people who had come because they were trying to find a way back to something. Vicky stood up at the front without notes. She talked about the accident, not as a story she had rehearsed, but as something that had happened to her and that she was still making sense of. She talked about what it felt like when people looked at her arm before they looked at her face. She talked about what it felt like when they didn't. I stood at the back of the room. I watched people in those folding chairs lean forward, one by one, as she spoke. I watched a man in his 50s with a cane reach up and wipe his eye with the back of his hand, and then look out the window like he hadn't done it. Afterward, 3 different people waited to speak with her. She gave each of them her full attention, the same quality of presence I'd experienced by those east windows 8 months earlier. Walking back to the car, she said, "That's the first time I've talked about it without feeling like I was performing the right version of how I'm supposed to have gotten through it." I said, "You weren't." She said, "No, I wasn't." The foundation's work expanded that year. We added 2 new partner communities in northwestern Ontario, launched a bursary for first responders' dependents entering post-secondary school, and began a partnership with a rehabilitation hospital in Ottawa that we'd been working toward for 18 months. The donor base grew in ways that surprised even Robert, who was not a man who surprised easily. Vicky began spending more time in Toronto. She kept her apartment in Vancouver, kept the connections she'd built there, but the balance shifted. She joined the foundation's board formally in the autumn. At the first board meeting she attended in that capacity, she proposed a new stream of programming for people whose injuries had come from helping others, an observation born from the consistent gap she kept encountering in the peer support landscape. The board approved it in the same meeting, which, I was told by someone who had been with the foundation for 11 years, was not how board meetings typically went. I watched her across the table as she walked through the proposal, and I thought, here is someone who knows exactly what she's doing, and who got here by refusing, over and over, to let other people's discomfort become her limitation. There is a version of this story where I'd tell you I knew, even back at the gala, that something important was happening. But that would be too clean. The truth is, I walked across that room because it was the right thing to do in that moment, without a calculation of what it might lead to. And what it led to was bigger and longer and more real than anything a calculation could have predicted. If this story has meant something to you, please take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who needs to hear that how we treat people when it costs us. Something reveals everything about who we are. And before I finish, I want to ask you something. Comment the word "found" if you've ever met someone who looked at you and actually saw you. Because that's what Vicky told me. At the end of a very long and ordinary Tuesday in the King Street West office. When we'd been working alongside each other for just over a year, she said, "You know what you did that night at the gala?" I said I had some idea. She said, "You didn't save me. I want to be clear about that. I was surviving. I'd been surviving for 3 years and I would have kept surviving." She paused. She said, "But you reminded me that surviving wasn't the whole point." I have turned that sentence over in my head more times than I can count. I've held it up to different kinds of light, and every time I do, I find something in it I hadn't seen before. Robert Alderton once told me, in one of the few personal conversations we've had over the past 2 years, that his daughter used to be afraid of large rooms. Not the people in them exactly, but the geometry of attention, the way a room could make you feel simultaneously overexposed and completely invisible. He said she wasn't afraid of rooms anymore. I don't take credit for that. Vicky did the work. She walked back into every room that felt too bright and too full of eyes, and she stood in it, and she kept standing in it until it became ordinary. That took something I don't have a word for that's adequate to the thing itself. What I know is this. I walked across a ballroom floor and I talked to a person who was standing alone, and that was the whole of what I did. No strategy, no calculation, just the very basic human decision to cross the distance between where you are and where someone else is standing. It turned out the distance wasn't as far as it looked. I think about that sometimes when I'm in a room and I see someone holding a glass of water they're not drinking, and their shoulders have that particular tension in them, and the rest of the room is finding somewhere else to be. I think the bravest thing is not always the loudest thing. Sometimes it's the quiet act of choosing not to look away. I didn't know that December evening in Toronto that I was walking toward the most important chapter of my life. I was just walking toward another person. Turns out that's usually how it starts.